Good morning. My name is Gretta Pecl and I'm from IMAS and the Centre for Marine Socioecology. I wanted to start off by acknowledging my co-authors that you can see on the screen there and a short acknowledgement of country. Today I'm speaking to you from Nipaluna Lutruwita, also known as Hobart, Tasmania, and I wanted to acknowledge with deep respect the Muwinina people who have cared for country for many, many thousands of years. This session of AMSA is all about delivering to the UN Decade of Ocean Sciences for Sustainable Development and the science that we need for the ocean that we want so that we can have the ocean we need for the future that we want. The UN Decade has a suite of goals that the marine community are planning on working together to strategically achieve, and many of these priority areas and activities revolve around getting more data, which is great. We all love to have more data. However, we typically don't use the data that we have. There are enormous gaps between science and policy, and often, although we would like it to, data does not usually or not always lead to decisions, actions, and impact. And I think ultimately that's because people make decisions, not data. Many of these knowledge action gaps are actually growing. Take climate change, for example. Emissions and temperature, as we know, are increasing. And at the same time, our knowledge production around climate change has escalated. There have been, as we all know, many reports, hundreds of thousands of publications. We've never known so much about a challenge for humanity and done so little. So a lot of information doesn't necessarily translate into the action that we want. So we wanted to know, in the context of oceans, what could the future look like if the knowledge that we already had available was actually used, and how could we get there? And I was really personally very interested in this concept, as I know that research on communication tells us that messages of doom and gloom typically overwhelm people, make them feel powerless, and make them switch off, which is actually the complete opposite of what we want. But I also feel quite fraudulent talking to audiences and being optimistic about what the future holds, because that's not where we're headed in many perspectives. So I wondered, what was could we present the future that we're headed towards and also the technically possible optimistic future at the same time? So I was really interested in this idea of what the future could technically look like. So for several major challenges in the oceans, we set about developing scenarios of these alternative futures for the ocean, the business as usual and the technically possible more sustainable future, the future we could have if we used the knowledge and technology available that we already have, and using the sustainable development goals as a guide to push towards. So it wasn't us deciding what the future should look like. We were using the sustainable development goals as that guide of where we could technically get to. And the difference between these two futures, the business as usual and the sustainable technically possible one, are those human factors. They're around the choices, behaviour, values, decisions, management, political will, all those kinds of factors. So we set about developing these two futures for many different key challenges in our oceans. We selected these challenges by identifying them from the many different global assessments and reports that are available. And then we surveyed the people within our research centre to identify which of these key challenges or what's the suite of major challenges that we felt like we had the skills and capacity to put teams together to try and address. So there were things like pollution and climate change, feeding the world, those kinds of issues, along with some synthesis papers as well. So the Future Seas project is essentially a special issue. It's out in September this year, but many papers are already available online. And each of these papers focused on a key challenge. They were short evidence-informed perspective pieces. They outline those two futures, the business as usual and the sustainable, technically possible future. And they're really interdisciplinary, whole of system approaches to try and outline a pathway to a sustainable future for each of those challenges, and they're at a global level. We very specifically had early career researchers lead these papers, and I'll explain why that was later. A key defining aspect of the project, other than there being those two futures that we explored, is the interdisciplinary nature of the project. So we purposefully included many different disciplines, explicitly including psychology, so people working with human behaviour, social science, governance, law, economics. We had really interdisciplinary teams behind these papers, and we also invited a traditional and Indigenous scholar and elder team to work with us as well, and they worked on their own Indigenous-led challenge and also contributed to whichever papers they wished to from our journal. So we were trying to work across different knowledge systems as well. Overall, the project used a technique called foresighting, which is a type of scenario development. It's become really popular lately, particularly in the context of government departments and different industry sectors trying to envisage what the future holds for their different sectors or departments. Essentially, foresighting is the inclusion of existing available data, most often incorporating those into conceptual models to envisage the future. There is extensive information for us to consider in this way, and our approach for these papers was a global one, and many of the publications and data sources were available to look at, including key physical, ecological, socio-economic, political, technological trends that related to the future. After the foresighting step to envisage these futures, there's a process of backcasting to develop a pathway of actions at local, regional and global scales. So often when we develop goals in general, the indicators for these are often far removed from the actions or the interventions needed, and this process of backcasting involved disaggregating the problem or our challenge into the contributing drivers, where we could identify distinct tasks and specific individuals or actors that might impact that key driver or that key influence on our challenge, so that we could try and steer that driver towards the outcome, or in this case, the future that you want. So in summary, this process involves identifying the particular challenge and being clear about the assumptions that we're working under, identifying those key drivers of change that have high potential for both impact on the challenge, so impact on food security or impact on plastic pollution, and the driver was also drivers that we could influence and help create the scenarios and the pathways and the roadmaps. So you end up with a roadmap or a pathway of actions that are needed to lead towards the future identified. And then there's a final step of doubling back and just checking that the pathway we've worked out does lead to the future that we've envisaged, that it's a technically possible process. For example, one of our studies in the Future Seas project looked at conservation of marine biodiversity by 2030. Most of these challenges identified 2030 as their endpoint, that being actions that we could achieve over the sustainable, over the UN Decade for Ocean Sciences. The main drivers identified for this challenge, so those drivers that we could influence, that would have impact that would influence the fate of conservation. These are all human drivers, so sectoral stewardship, management and governance, financial mechanisms, social impetus for conservation. All the actions in the pathways for this challenge were all things that influenced one of those four drivers. And considering the way that these human elements limit or facilitate action and interest on biodiversity loss and climate change is really important. So at the moment, the future of biodiversity is limited by people and not our science per se. So many of the drivers we identified had actions to do with stewardship and social expectations. So the way that we communicate framing and messaging and how we connect with people's values and emotions, all of those things are really important. And I think there are obviously many factors influencing the way that our science is used and implemented, but it is an undeniable fact that that gap between what we know about these problems and what we do as a society are rapidly growing. So I think in addition to being interested in the ecological dimensions of natural systems, which, personally I find pretty fascinating, we need to think about changing the way that we communicate and we do science, working closely with other experts who do this, unless we want our careers to be about documenting decline ever more robustly. So each of these papers that we developed had a pathway of actions at different scales to push towards achieving the more sustainable version of the future. And although the whole special issue comes out in September, there is a suite of these papers that are out already. The project is listed as a voluntary commitment under the UN Decade, and we've already received invitations to speak at some UN high-level forums about the outcomes. There were a number of other outcomes for the project as well, in particular for our ECRs. So they got to have experience leading teams, working across disciplines, learning about new knowledge systems, thinking about how to have impact. And it was a really creative opportunity, I think, for contributing to the UN Decade and learning about or learning new ways of thinking about our science and about having impact. And that's ultimately what the decade is all about. So thank you very much. Thank you for listening to my 400th version of this talk.